Christopher Guest's films are the perfect comfort food for quarantine. The gently bizarre characters, the breezy improvised dialogue, the mockumentary style, everything is so nice. It's fun to watch these people chase their dreams, even if those dreams might be a bit unrealistic. But there's an argument amongst champions and critics of the director of Best in Show, A Mighty Wind, and Waiting for Guffman, one that's been raging for almost 30 years now. Some see his films as beautiful celebrations of everyday people who dare to chase lofty, impractical goals. Others see these same films as cruelly punching down and mocking people who try to be just a little bit more than ordinary. How can there be such a fundamental disagreement on the intent of these films, though? It may be because Guest himself can't quite make up his mind. He disagrees with the accusation of cruelty, of course. There's nothing inherently funny about people who succeed. You don't see people who are smart and good at what they do. Where's the joke? But to see people striving to be something and to be maybe delusional, you can feel for them. Because most people aren't exactly where they want to be in life, that's the case for 99% of people. To me, that's more interesting. And there lies the disconnect. It's obvious that Guest cares about his characters. He's fascinated by the struggle and desire of notoriety, that desperation for something resembling fame. And he's amazing at getting empathetic performances out of his actors. He builds his process around it. When he writes a script for a film, it's about 20 pages long. It has all of the events and beats of a traditional screenplay, but none of the dialogue. He gives his troupe of seasoned comedy veterans almost endless creative freedom to inhabit and craft stunningly real human beings. The situations may be staged, but the interactions, the conversations, and the emotions are all being generated by the performers. These so-called mockumentaries are then edited together like actual documentaries, pulling 90 minutes out of 90 hours of raw material. All of this leads to Guest's films feeling authentic, honest even. But if there's a fine line between stupid and clever, there's an even finer line between honest and cruel. Oddly, the reason Guest's treatment of his characters is so contested is precisely because he is so adept at crafting empathetic performances. The characters that populate his films may be moderately ridiculous, but they're uncanny stand-ins for the ordinary people we encounter every day. And in the act of inviting you to extend your empathy towards these hungry, yearning, deeply earnest people, he uses that same empathy to twist the knife. And he always twists it in the same place, the denouement. Up until that 6 months later tag, his films are sensitive, caring, and full of a calculatedly droll empathy that simultaneously keeps you distanced and engaged. But after Guffman doesn't come, after the Best in Show is awarded, after that concert goes off the air, he pulls out the rug. Throughout Guest's filmography, we see the same trend in all of his films. Emotional catharsis followed by a harsh snap back to reality. Maybe it makes sense. Not everybody can win in a comedy. And maybe some of the emotional catharsis comes from that dreamlike high of the group event, but there's something so bleak about what comes next for our protagonists. The juxtaposition of the end of Waiting for Guffman and its denouement is perhaps the most across-the-board cruel. There's a gorgeous, rising joy to watching these mostly untalented but heartfelt amateurs pull off an earnest and entertaining musical tribute to their hometown. It's not Shakespeare, but it's genuine. Even without the presence of a renowned Broadway producer to critique their show and send them all to fame and fortune, Red, White, and Blaine does exactly what it sets out to do. But Guest has a strange way of punishing ambition. Dr. Alan Pearl moves to Miami to pursue a career in showbiz. On its face, that seems sweet and delightful, but the tone is shifted from gentle encouragement to full-on desperation. Guest, as a sort of documentary editor, has the ability to contextualize Dr. Pearl's grandiose sense of his own talent, and chooses to juxtapose it with the reality of Alan's situation. He's performing for a captive, bored audience of senior citizens who give him absolutely no reaction. Ron and Sheila move to Hollywood and seem to immediately have work as background extras in a boot commercial, but as their interview goes on, that same sense of desperation seems to grow. Ron exudes confidence, but you can see Sheila disintegrating inside. She knows that this isn't going according to plan and only gives the weakest of support to Ron's misplaced optimism. Their story ends in such a hopeless place, with Ron giving Sheila micromanaging performance notes while she plasters on an enormous, uncomfortably fake smile for the camera. Libby, the ingenue of the film, manages to get out of Blaine, but ends up in an even smaller town in Alabama. She had dreams of following Corky to New York, but she's back where she started, working in a Dairy Queen. And speaking of Corky, his ending is maybe the most optimistic of the lot, but not by much. While he does finally move back to New York City, his dream of being on Broadway isn't as easy as he thought it would be. Instead, he runs a strange movie memorabilia store that sells action figures from My Dinner with Andre and Remains of the Day lunchboxes. The irony of this isn't that hard to track. He's trapped in the place where he wants to be, surrounded by things that nobody really wants. While the characters themselves may be or seem happy, the overwatching eye of Guest as craftsman of his story, as well as the final arbiter and editor of character, turns our eye to the inherent tragedy of our starry-eyed hopefuls and wannabes. Guest as a filmmaker is fascinated by fame, its fleeting nature, its relative usage. He loves people who are famous to a few or famous in their own minds. He loves the waning of fame. He loves to see what people do when they get just a sliver of it and how it inevitably corrupts. And he takes any piece of victory for our characters and manages to spin it into some kind of cosmic existential defeat. This may be the ultimate problem with Guest as a filmmaker. In that obsession with fame, he presupposes a dark ending. There's never anything good that comes out of victory or achievement in a Christopher Guest film. It's just a means to an end. And that direct quest for fleeting fame is so apparent in Best in Show, his follow-up to Waiting for Guffman. His protagonists are all more or less using the Mayflower Dog Show to work out personal issues. That's the grand common thread that anchors all of these films, though. It's what makes them so good to watch. These moments of intense planning, preparation, and risk, and the effects they have on the people caught up in them. But while the film is, for the most part, quite sweet, Guest movies tend to lack traditional villains. It's more consistently barbed. He's bringing his characters just one step further out into the realm of the ridiculous, into parody, something more closely resembling a traditional comedy. Be that from the ridiculously high-strung neuroses of the Swans, or the dopiness of a post-American Pie Eugene Levy. These characters are still real people adjacent, but they feel more like the stories you've heard about them and not the people themselves. Best in Show also builds to a moment of bliss and catharsis as we watch hapless, sweet Jerry Fleck lead his terrier to victory to a rapturous crowd of dog show attendees. It's pure sports movie underdog triumph, and it's unbelievably satisfying. But then that tag hits. That pesky 6 months later, and we're thrown right back into the grand Christopher Guest walkback. For Cookie and Jerry, their post-victory life involves spinning their newly found fame, with heavy scare quotes, into a deeply terrible terrier-based recording career that just reveals how hollow their victory was.
Terrier style! Bow wow! Delish! Bow wow! Some dish!
Once they reach the top of this giant mountain, they realize it's just a stepping stone to something less satisfying. Even the performances get more broadly pathetic, with Levy really hitting home his desperation and disappointment when Cookie is confronted with yet another one of her past lovers. After Sherry Ann and Christie's cathartic moment of passion, they get together and open American Bitch, a magazine for lesbian purebred dog owners. That kind of narrowcasting in a publication is either bound for greatness or an early grave, but it's easy to see that their romantic pairing is tenuous at best. Christie, like always, is doing the majority of the work. Nothing gets to sit in a Christopher Guest movie. The tension is always shifting, changing hands from one performer to another. Perhaps that's the improv comedy of it all. Yes, and. Harlan's post-show story is a sad and pathetic mirror of Cookie and Jerry's fate, and more importantly, Dr. Alan Pearl's denouement in Waiting for Guffman. He performs his new passion, ventriloquism, poorly in front of a smattering of entirely disengaged elderly veterans. It's fascinating to see him laid this low. His character always seems like the most down-to-earth and stable, so to watch him lose a lot of his self-awareness in the service of a depressingly catastrophic piece of ill-conceived showmanship is jarring, to say the least. For a bright spot, we move to Stefan and Scott, who have the most optimistic ending. They were fine before the show, they were fine during the show, they'll be fine afterwards. They follow their bliss, and that bliss has shifted to a Shih Tzu calendar based on classic movies that they may or may not sell for a charity or not a charity. Dumb idea? Maybe. Filled with a lot of self-seriousness and attention to detail? Definitely. Maybe their ending is so happy because throughout the film they treated their dogs like family, and this particular family unit doesn't really have any dysfunction. It's admirable. Finally, we end where we began, with Meg and Hamilton Swan, who have a new dog and a new outlook on life. We don't know what happened to the Weimaraner. Nothing good. The final beat of Best in Show involves the Swans describing how much better their sex life is now as their new tiny pug humps the leg of their psychiatrist. Serious-minded people laid low by uncontrollable urges. It'd be a perfect metaphor if it wasn't so silly. The closer Guest gets to emotional beauty and simple, plain-spoken honesty, the further he backpedals in his epilogues, and that's the most apparent in A Mighty Wind. It's by far Guest's best film and also his most emotionally resonant. He finally manages to combine the showmanship and attention to detail of Spinal Tap, the beating, tender heart for niche entertainment of Waiting for Guffman, and his hilarious fascination with the world of privileged weirdos of Best in Show. A Mighty Wind's finale is breathtaking. It's a testament to the fact that while this kind of movie has improvised dialogue, the actual story needs to be airtight in order for all the pieces to seamlessly come together. With the rekindling of passions between former paramours Mitch and Mickey as a white-hot catalyst, our 3 disparate folk acts come together for an impromptu final triumphant supergroup to perform the titular song A Mighty Wind. It's a staggeringly effective ending that makes all of the comedy that came before it melt away into a singular moment of joy that celebrates the mere act of performance. It's a giddy high that's immediately cut down by a sloppy denouement. It's a perfect joke that has a second, less funny punchline added on because the comedian didn't think you laughed enough. It's an ice cream sundae topped with a picture of your 5th birthday party where nobody showed up. A Mighty Wind's coda is sloppy, unfunny, and hateful towards its characters to a shocking extent. The new Main Street Singers don't really factor into the ending that much, relegated to a decently amusing Fred Willard monologue about how he got them a variety sitcom as Supreme Court justices. The real trouble here is Mitch and Mickey. Their kiss at the end of the rainbow, the moment that sparks the emotional resolution of the film, is essentially tossed out the window in order to service the joke that they're both in denial about what it meant to them. This isn't to say that they needed to fall madly and passionately back in love right there on the spot or anything, but the way Guest handles these 2 states of denial says more about how he sees his characters than he'd probably be willing to admit. Mitch is essentially fine. He's in denial, but he's fine. He's had a creative resurgence and he's finally able to write poetry again. His denial of his feelings for Mickey is funneled into pity for her, and it's just kind of gross, honestly. We see a strange, sad, complicated human being get turned into a simple slime ball, and it's disappointing. Mickey shares a fate with Spinal Tap, and Dr. Pearl, and Harlan Pepper. She plays her catheter-themed folk music for completely uninterested passersby at her husband's trade show booth. She's creatively activated again as well, but her fate is definitely shown as more pathetic, more contemptible. But the folksman, oh wow. Yes, a retread of the Spinal Tap fate again, same basic players here, but yikes. In a final swinging blow downward, Christopher Guest's most mature and contemplative film ends with a sustained note of graceless transphobia that deflates the whole movie like so much thunderous applause at a souffle factory. One could make the excuse of, oh, it was 2003 and they didn't know any better, but it's a tough point to argue. Mainly because Guest is capable of treating his subjects with such boundless kindness, understanding, and empathy, but he feels the need in the last 3 minutes of his nice movie about old folk musicians to turn one of his characters into a hateful punchline that makes the other characters feel uncomfortable. It's possible to do this sort of character work interestingly and sensitively, but this isn't it. There are trans folks more qualified to discuss this, so there's a link to an excellent essay on all of this in the description. From the big picture to mascots, Guest gets beautiful, empathetic performances out of his actors and himself that are honest and funny. His characters are well-realized people with stunningly realistic hopes and dreams. Maybe that's why it stings more when he denies those characters basic satisfaction, leaving them all almost invariably as wandering, oblivious, insatiable fame vacuums. While it may be socially prescient, it's not narratively satisfying. Guest is in a strange place as a director. He's a fake documentarian that also has to function as a real documentarian. If this were a more traditional film with a more traditional screenplay, maybe the tonal disconnect between the performances and the film would be less distinct. It certainly seems to be the case in For Your Consideration, where Guest uses all of the thematic and character elements of his documentaries, but with none of the documentary trappings. It comes out feeling forced and much more on its face cynical and cruel, but it's all in service of the greater satirization of the Hollywood hype machine. The vast majority of his films have this curious contradiction to them. They celebrate performance and performers, but demonize show business. More accurately, it could be said that a Christopher Guest film hates what show business does to people who dream of stardom. But Guest's biggest fear, his darkest fate, the one that drives this pathological need to mock anyone that dares to have a dream that's bigger than their ability, is one that's repeated in each and every one of his mockumentaries. Guest seems to fear that one day he will sing his heart's truest song, and not only will he be terrible at it, the audience won't even notice he exists. Spinal Tap's winding series of cancelled gigs leads them to playing for a half-full VFW hall. Dr. Pearl serenades indifferent retirees in Miami. Harlan Pepper bombs in front of World War II vets. Mickey sings elaborate catheter songs to bored medical convention attendees, and the folksmen are little more than window dressing at a Native American casino, their songs drowned out by the clang of slot machines. The subtle cruelty of Christopher Guest comes from fear. The fear of death, the fear of desperation, the fear of not being funny, not making an impact, the fear of being misunderstood. And that fear is taken out on his characters, because to Guest, that endless road of obscure mediocrity may very well be hell. And in that way, Guest is as vulnerable and earnest as his characters. His latest film, Mascots, arrived on Netflix in 2016 with a thunderous silence. The reviews were mixed, the promotion was almost non-existent, and the interest was mild, to say the least. In the vast, endless churning content machine that is Netflix, his quiet, niche voice was somehow even quieter. And his heart just seemed not in it. Maybe it was the lack of Eugene Levy as his longtime creative collaborator, but there's something so slight about Mascots. It has all the same intentions and structure of a guest film, but it's now unfortunately beholden to a lot of the stylistic elements that shows like Parks and Rec and The Office stole from Guest wholesale. Mascots came and went without fanfare. He hasn't made a movie since. But don't worry about Christopher Guest, he's fine. He's married to Jamie Lee Curtis, he spends a lot of the year out on a ranch in Idaho where he goes fly fishing almost every day. He lives a life of relative privilege and ease. He's a literal, actual British lord. Maybe he makes these films because he wants to pretend for a moment to be someone who isn't immediately granted a rarefied heir. Cosplaying is common, Zeus among men disguised as a swan. Maybe his status and stature blinds him from realizing that his celebration of these ordinary characters can often come across as condescending. To return to that quote of his, while there may be nothing inherently funny about people who succeed, Christopher Guest has managed to craft something more than just comedy. He's created a world surprisingly close to our own with characters you understand, love, and root for. He's created a world where these people live honestly and search for meaning and community. It wouldn't be funny, but wouldn't it be nice to just let them win once in a while? Thank you for watching Too Many Tapes. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notifications about new episodes. Who's your favorite Christopher Guest character? Let me know in the comments. Do you want to support a small YouTube creator? If so, you can donate to my Patreon with a link in the description. If you donate $20 or more a month, you're Chase Smith. I appreciate you so much, and your name gets to essentially take over the entire screen. If you donate $10 or more a month, you're a long-winded Fred Willard monologue, and your name gets to be pretty big, but not as big as the $20 tier. If you donate $5 or more a month, you're best in show, because you're all good boys and girls. At this tier, you get early access to videos, so get on it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time on Too Many Tapes.
It's such a fine line between stupid and
clever.
Yeah,
It's just
clever.
that little turnabout. Yeah.